Hi everyone, I'm Les,
And I'm Ashley.
and you're listening to Anthropotamus, where we explore some of your favorite anthropology topics.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our latest episode of Anthropotamus. We're here today with Dr. Rosalind Morris, anthropology professor at Columbia University, and we will be discussing with her new book, Unstable Ground: The Lives, Deaths, and Afterlives of Gold in South Africa. Thank you, Rosalind, so much for coming on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for taking the time to read the book and giving me a chance to speak more about it.
So, before we get into the book, your research, you have what's the word I want to use? I mean, you're in photography, you've done a documentary, you're into ethnography and social theory. I mean, what led you into anthropology and specifically your research in South Africa?
Well, those are big questions. And I've been doing this for a very long time, so I'm not sure that I could recall what it was that prompted me to turn to anthropology as an undergraduate. I actually started off in pre-med, um, and then moved through literature and philosophy to anthropology. And I think the attraction of the discipline for me was its capacity to permit questions that would go almost anywhere and everywhere, and that would allow for both the theoretical engagement of various disciplines, but also the methodological possibilities of both very fine empirical analysis and more speculative work. But I started off actually as a Southeast Asianist. My first work was in mainland Southeast Asia, mostly in Thailand, around questions of cultural politics. And that work took place at a time when the Thai state was undergoing enormous transformations and when it really took arms against its democratic populations. And I found it harder and harder to work there and harder um, to undertake the kind of intellectual work that I wanted to. When I visited South Africa first in 1996, I found myself absolutely enchanted by what I saw in terms of people's willingness and desire to change their their worlds, the willingness to undertake that labor, the critical labor, but also the personally transformative labor. And so I turned my attention to South Africa. I had many family connections to the country, but had avoided it during the apartheid years. And I never regretted it. I have learned from that work and from the people I encountered there in ways I could never have imagined and for which I have no regrets.
So, your book goes into all the dangers miners go through, discussing the value of gold and how it impacts community. Um, And regularly you discuss the dangers that miners face on a regular basis. What, if any, social impacts did you observe while you were out there?
I mean, I think one of the things that you learn from this book, or I hope you learn from this book, is that mining is a kind of total social fact. And it not only oriented the political organization of the South African polity and its relationships with other countries, but it saturated the whole social field. It reoriented gender relations. It inflected people's understanding of history, their relationship to ancestors, the question of value, what labor means. Um, and maybe in this very big fat book,
Mm.
maybe the enormity of the book is a response to that fact that it is impossible to isolate as a sector of an economy, for example. When I started thinking of this as a book, as opposed to a process of learning about this world, I actually imagined it to be a story about accident. Accident both as the horizon of lived experience, and of course, as an object of industrial managerial practice and labor activist opposition, but also as a kind of concept metaphor for history. Why is it that, Black people in South Africa were only by virtue of the place in which they were born, subject to the oppressions of that industry and displaced in the way they were. Um, and over the years, of course, that question of accident remained and was reinflected, became both more concrete and more abstract. So we could talk about any one of those dimensions, about family life, about the ways in which people understand their mortality, about their relationship to ancestors. Um, but all of that has to be understood against the backdrop that gold was the currency of globalization, the mechanism of globalization, the means by which British established its imperial hegemony, and so forth. And one of the things in the book is that I try to move between very, very granular descriptions of what everyday life is like in, say, informal settlements or in townships or in these utopian dream towns that were built around the very, very deep gold mines in South Africa and the Witwatersrand in particular. Um, so it's between that granular level and these big macroeconomic and big historical processes. So it's constantly moving you back and forth and asking you to think about how those big structures impacted people's lives.
Yeah, I did notice that you were you in your writing you had a tendency to go from the big picture into the really micro zoomed in stories back and forth. I thought that was a pretty interesting writing style or stylistic choice. Um, it definitely kept me engaged, I'll put it that way. Um,
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. When you're dealing with a history so complex and so deep that implicates all of us, not just in South Africa, but everywhere in the world, in the gold made world, you need narrative to keep you going. But also, I wanted this to be a kind of act of witnessing, a testimony to the people and the lives that I was privileged to learn from.
Absolutely. I also do think that it's and you probably said this, but it's very important to just highlight that you're right. We are in a gold made world, and this is very much from what I was able to parse from it is just a glimpse behind the curtain, if you will. Just kind of I don't think most people in say the United States, for example, realize how much hardship goes into actually creating everything that makes our world work. And this really pulls the curtain back and shows what is happening.
Yeah, no, that's nicely said. That's one of the main goals of the book. So
Mhm.
if it worked for you in that way, that's great. That makes me very happy. Everything from your cell phone to your watches to your jewelry, whether you treat that as a kind of store of value, whether it's dowry goods or whether it's just bling that, signifies one's fashion sensibility and one's, uh, social symbolic power. Gold is everywhere.
Mhm.
It's increasingly coming from sources outside of this formal industry and its kind of ruin and its ruins. And as you know in the book, I start with that world of the ruin. Um, this is an economy that was produced in and by and on a threshold of finitude because gold, is limited. And even the deepest mines and the ones in South Africa are deeper than anywhere else in the world. I mean, it's kind of crazy to imagine these mines that are 3.5 miles deep. Um, but even in that context, there are limits. And so we now see, and the book traces the arc from the beginning to our contemporary moment in which many of those mines are closing or reaching their limit of what is called in the industry ability. It costs more to get the gold out than can be made in profits, or
Hmm.
even just the coverage of costs.
Yeah, I thought it was, I mean, gold mining is not something I usually think about. I don't really, didn't really know anything about gold mining. And being here in California, we're always taught about gold mining in California, which is nothing like in Africa. So I think we still have as Americans this like image in our heads of like old men screening gold in pans by the water. We don't really realize how dangerous it is. And like maybe we might think of like diamonds.
I think the closest analogy that we have would be like the coal mines, especially in
Mm,
like the like East Coast
mm,
area, the deep coal mines. I've heard some stories from people who I know have worked adjacent to that field, not specifically in it. I actually do have an uncle who works in the gold mining industry abroad. So he was heavy machinery operator. So he would work on the larger strip mines, not the deep delving mines, but so I've heard some things about it here and there. But yeah, so I think that the consciousness that I always had of mining was very much in context of like California mining, where you're mostly prospecting via the rivers and other things like that. You don't see a lot of, you know, underground mining, things like that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. This kind of dream of the gold rush, of rush in general, and of speculation, prospecting, and the dream of the sudden big find and of instantaneous wealth is, a key part of the ideology of gold. And it's one of the great reasons why we don't think about all the labor that goes into it, all both the labor of actual extraction and the labor that has gone into the production of the technology and the infrastructure of these mines. But um, there was, of course, a rush in South Africa as well in the late 1880s, 1890s, and the early part of this of my book describes that. But we have to ask ourselves, for whom is gold the object of a rush? It's obviously, prospectors dream of that find. In that initial period where people are running about staking their claims, usually small claims, and hoping that they'll find a little gold, that tends to be in areas where the mining is essentially taking alluvial forms or it's on the surface. And then you have these two larger forms of mining, which entail either open cast, as you describe, or deep level mining. And in fact, there was a long period in South Africa when it was assumed that people wouldn't be able to undertake deep level mining because for very strange reasons, geological reasons, the gold in that area is very strongly bound to conglomerate rock and it's very difficult to separate. And it's only in the 1890s that the cyanide hydrocyanidation method was developed. And South Africa was the place where that was really tried out, even though it was tried out by under the influence of American technologists. It was tried out there as as though the country was a giant laboratory. And thus began the age of cyanide-based gold extraction. And this is one of the stories that's generally not told in South Africa or in other histories that we often hear about, the dependency of deep level mining on and open cast mining on dynamite. But we don't hear about the cyanide revolution and what it entailed. And in this book, I try to argue that, you know, cyanide came to be imagined simply as a technology, a fix for the geological problem that you couldn't extract the rock. But in fact, because it was very expensive, it authorized the repression of wages, and that was done in South Africa in ways that depended on the racialization of the labor force and the exclusion of Black South Africans from higher pay grades and so forth. So that's one of the stories that I wanted to tell. But even today, it's very hard to get rid of that dream of the sudden discovery. And informal miners, for example, who are coming from Malawi or Zimbabwe or Zambia or Mozambique to scavenge in the ruins of these deep mines, they are still beholden to that idea that they might just find enough gold to make it big, or at least to live. And between that first rush in the 1880s, which came after the gold rush in the US, and Australia and Canada and Russia, between that first gold rush and this second kind of ruinous gold rush, there was the whole history by which those little plots, those little claims were bought up, consolidated, and turned into monopoly capital by these very large corporations, many of which got their capital in the diamond fields in South Africa. So think of people like Rhodes and Alfred Bate, his right-hand man. They transferred the profits from diamonds to gold. And in fact, Rhodes had to be persuaded that cyanide would let them make a profit on the basis of this deep level extraction. But people still hedge their bets. They still believe that gold is somehow miraculously the real source, the real measure, the real locus of real value. It's one of the most persistent ideas, I think, in our economic lives.
I can absolutely see that. I mean, I've always heard the adage, miners don't make money, the shop owners do.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Anthony Trollope, the novelist who visited South Africa and wrote about the gold industry, he said exactly that, the people who were going to get rich were the sellers of wine and goods and the owners of shops and so forth. And that was true. But, we should also be clear that the people who made the very big profits were indeed those mining corporations um, who were employing these hundreds of thousands of workers and extracting really extraordinary profits.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when I think of that phrase, when I say miners, my thought goes to the actual worker, not the corporation. The corporations
Yeah,
are going to absolutely make money. That's
yeah,
what they're
for
designed to
sure.
do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I shared that sense, and this book actually spends relatively little time in boardrooms. And one could say, well, that's a weakness. One should also, be studying up, as one used to say in the 80s, I suppose. But my commitments here were to describe the lived realities of the people who are most immediately caught up in these enormous transformations.
I'm going to go ahead and skip over one of these questions 'cause I feel like the next question flows a little bit more into what we're already discussing. We talk about the value of gold in your book, or you talk about, not we talk about, you talk about the value
I
of
hope you'll
gold.
talk about it too.
Uh, right, and how it's, kind of manipulating society to give it value. Can you discuss how these actions help perpetuate the cycle of poverty among the miners while keeping those in charge on top?
Well, gosh, that's a complicated story. In the case of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, the development of the gold industry really basically transformed every element of that world. And first of all, there were no communities, no towns, no cities, no dense social life in that part of the world before the discovery of gold. Johannesburg itself went from 0 to 100,000 in less than a decade. But then you had the building of what we could call like peri-urban communities around the mines. And those were highly stratified. They were, as urban design phenomena, they were intended for white skilled laborers who came often from Britain and other parts of Europe, places like Cornwall and so forth, and for the managerial class. And black mine workers were, at least in the early part of the 20th century and forward, were not permitted to reside permanently in urban spaces after 1922, when the South African state began to retreat in its movement towards the granting of rights to Black subjects. So those Black people were forced to migrate from places on which they had also been forced to reside and on relatively short-term contracts. So they resided in barracks, single-sex barracks usually. And as many people wrote about and at that time and since, that led to fragmentations of social forms. Women had to remain on those in those reservations, or later called Bantustans, and unless they were permitted to travel for domestic labor. So you had the creation of this transient, unrooted, enormous class of Black laborers who made very little and about whom the mining corporations and the state variously said they either didn't want to accumulate enough, i.e., they were lazy, or they wasted their money, i.e., they were, prodigal wasters, or these guys depended on the women to do all the agricultural labor and so forth. But this was a process of immiseration, of expropriation of land, of then the confinement of people to increasingly unviable land, and then the forcing of them through taxes and other means into wage labor. So that story is well known. It's a kind of story of what we call primitive accumulation in many parts of the world. So the question is, what happened in the aftermath of that kind of fairly obvious and intentional production of inequality, of radical inequality? And it included all sorts of things, the exclusion of Black people from education that would be anything other than minimally vocationally preparatory, to laws against capital accumulation, property ownership, household ownership in urban areas, to the regulation of life through things like pass laws um, and South Africa today has the highest Gini coefficient in the world. It's the most unequal society in the world. So it was an effective process. People remained outside of the realm of, I suppose just habitability. Never mind capital accumulation. They were pushed to the limit of habitability. And beginning in the 70s or 80s, thanks to emerging labor activism and so forth and other social movements, a lot of those laws changed. It became possible for people to live together, to move to the areas around the mines. Um, but you could see from the start that they, even in a town like Carltonville, which I talk about in this book, now in an area called Merifong, that the white town was built and then a Black township was built 5 or 6 kilometers away, separated by a kind of no man's land, with minimal facilities, little few things like, sewerage, schools, even basic facilities that would let you pay the taxes you were required to pay. And, those conditions reproduce themselves. And they have not only not been ameliorated since the end of apartheid, but they have been complicated by the fact that the regional economies have failed, the gold industry has contracted, unemployment has risen. So in some of those areas, you have unemployment rates of, over 40 or 50%, and that gets even higher among youth. So yes, poverty remains a kind of structurally induced and reproduced phenomenon, and people remarkably survive in the midst of all that. So, statistics tell you some things, and then you need to listen to people and learn from them how they actually live. But it's not uncommon for one person in South Africa who is a wage earner to support 25 people.
Mm.
And that, so even where there is an opportunity for one person to get access to employment and on the basis of education or not, that's going to be dissipated very quickly when it's spread across 25 people or more. And, there are other factors. I mean, debt has been a huge problem and is a huge problem. Demonetization, which means that you can only participate in the formal economy if you have a bank account and so forth. That means that you have to be documented. So all of those old technologies that were developed in and for the mines have continued to exercise these kind of haunting effects. And you could say that had the industry, and the gold industry was the largest part of the economy until the 1970s, had that distributed the profits that were made in that industry in ways that were more equitable, things might be different now. And that sounds like a kind of really, I mean, that's a very depressing story. It is a depressing story. I mean, it's agonizing to see the destitution in which so many people have to live. But it's also the case that people do find ways to support each other, to pursue their pleasures and their desires, to have families and care for their families, and to produce networks of solidarity and engage in political protest and all sorts of things.
Now you pretty much answered this question already. Um, but right in the you return at the end of the book, you return and you discuss how gold had an impact on artists. Could you give other more specific examples, such as, how gold influenced music, Um, how it's influenced those who did not directly work in the mines.
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that question because another part of this book is an argument that, most of the studies of gold mining have been about miners, mine workers, and miners, and those terms are separate. Miners tends to refer to the owners, and mine workers to
Mm-hmm.
those who work. But mining towns, and I grew up in a mining town, so I understand this. Mining towns are full of people who mostly don't work in the mines. And I wanted to make that visible. So from teachers to prostitutes to clergy people to, the guy who owns the gas station to all mechanics, all of these people live in and around these worlds. So, and that's true, of course, for the artist as well. The book ends by going back to this township, Kutzon, that was built to service this little gold mining dream town called Carltonville. The population of it quickly outnumbered that town by tenfold
Mm.
and still does. And it's desperately poor, and it's been the scene of many, many insurrectionary protests and also very difficult gang-based conflicts. But in that world, I was very moved to see these young people, trying to find forms of expressing their ambitions, their relationship to a world that was constantly presented to them as the source of economic power, but which they didn't get to partake of. So I described the work of this little collective called in Kutzong that made up a video, Kut 16. And these are rappers and music producers, poets, playwrights, and so forth. And it's interesting that they speak about Johannesburg, they speak about the city of gold, but oddly enough, though their entire lives were determined by it, it's not immediately narrated or present in those works. What is present in those works is the social kind of both the wreckage and the ambition that it generated. Now, there's almost no part of the cultural sphere in South Africa that isn't marked by gold. From the highest levels, you have people like William Kentridge, whose entire oeuvre is about the making of Johannesburg in and by the gold industry. It's landscapes of mine dumps and so forth, rising and disappearing, the life of corporate capital, the life of the mines. This is absolutely central to his work. You find it in all the landscape painting of South Africa. And you find it in this really very intense, energized world of rap and hip hop. Um, and there you hear about all the rest. You hear about um, the sexual dynamics of that world. You hear about or you hear people playing with the idiom of the Wild West. You hear them borrowing other tropes that come from other places where gold mining and rushes were part of the scene. You hear a lot about what you hear in other such traditions about masculinity and its thwarting and its desired restitution. That's it. That marks all of that world. And of course, you see it in the way that people perform and the way that, they wear their bling and in the way that the women accuse the men of not turning their money into the means to support families, but into bling and fashion and so forth. An early part of the book considers the poetry of very interesting women who, during the early days of the industry, gave voice to some of the most radical critiques of it and of people's complicities with it. So the poet Nansisi Mkweto, and that, I know that that name is going to turn up in your podcast as a problem because of the click. Nansisi Mkweto, she was one of the greatest poets of her generation, and she was part of a group of women who invented the strategy of passive resistance. And poetry was really crucial in mobilizing people. You had people reading poems or rather reciting them, because it was an oratorical practice, to audiences of tens of thousands of people. And even during the heyday of the anti-apartheid movement, when you had people, tens of thousands of people gathering in soccer stadiums, poets read and performed and gave voice to this kind of absolutely insurgent desire for freedom. It's been a really important part of that counter discourse. And I would say rap as some of this rap as being on the far end of that movement that starts with that kind of poetry. And in between, you have the song traditions of the mine workers who like Safela, sung by the Sutu mine workers who travel from Lesotho to the mines and so forth. So I think that that's a really crucial domain for understanding how it is that people appropriated, understood, and then re-signified the world that gold made.
So you have some moments in your book that really stand out. In the beginning, you discuss that woman. If I
Mm.
remember correctly, her husband died, and then she's about to leave, and she takes the clothes off the baby and returns it. I think that first moment you write, it kind of really hits you the level of poverty. And then you have the other one that stood out to me the most was that guy who just started off in the mines and he decided to run off without his team and then he gets stuck there for 2 days and I'm thinking, Guy, what are you thinking? Why would you do that? And he's just sitting there for 2 days and I'm just like, oh my God, this poor guy. He could have died. He could have just died and his body could have just never been found. And I couldn't believe he just ran off like that. Um, but you've done so much research out there with all your experiences and all the stories you've been told. Is there a specific memory that really sticks with you or impacts you?
Well, many, but I won't, don't worry, I won't. But you know, that story that opens the book and that you just mentioned, that those two moments come out of two spaces of real surprise. That was a terrible, terrible situation in which a young Zama, an informal miner, was killed.
Mhm.
And yes, his young wife, who had a 6-year-old baby, um, she had to go and identify the body, and she was, of course, fighting with the police to have the rights to send it to return it home, and for his colleagues who had retrieved the body to not be arrested.
Mm.
And much of that whole episode was shocking and angering and grief-inducing. But because she had borrowed clothes for that child in that cold night and had felt that she should return it, that was absolutely dismaying to me, both because of the depth of, I mean, just for lack of better word, her sense of obligation and honesty and respect for the person who had lent her those things, and the depth of her need, and the place in which she resided was kind of unimaginably without anything. And there were other parts of that story that were also amazing. You know, it was assumed that she would be blamed for this, that she would be
Mm.
accused of witchcraft, as happens when an accident occurs. And the family of that man did it refused that. They said no. They took that child in and they ensured that she was able to return to her home safe. And I mean that there's this capacity for such generosity and you might say self-destructive respect for the laws of property was just a great provocation to me. I mean, it was a huge ethical challenge. As I often feel like I learned from these people how to live in lots of ways. Um, so that is absolutely seared in my mind as a kind of moment that opened up into all of the dimensions of that world. And the one that you described, this young man who in his youthful arrogance, I suppose, is what it was, trying to show that he could do what he didn't know how to do yet, had led to this terrible, dangerous situation. One that actually does occur. I mean, people do get lost underground and they do die and their bodies are never found. And that's a very big worry for people in that part of the
Mhm.
world because it's imperative that they be rejoined with their ancestral communities after death. But when I learned about that, I learned from him and I learned with him and others of his colleagues in the course of making a film called We Are Zama Zama, which kind of supplemented and transformed my ethnographic research. And young men in that project took cameras underground. And maybe one of the most shocking moments of my, nearly 30 years in that world now was when I watched down that footage for the first time and saw actually what it entails to scavenge in the ruins of the world's deepest mines, the absolute limit, where the body goes to the point where you either live or you don't, but there's nothing in between. I was absolutely devastated by that. I thought I had understood it. I have been underground, both in informal and formal mines, not to that extent. But I could not fathom that. There are times when a description just doesn't allow you to comprehend that. So that also incited in me a desire to understand, what would make people do that? What could lead you to pursue that mad, dangerous, desperate pursuit of money? Things really have to be bad for that to be the case. Um, I can offer structural explanations, but I think grasping the subjective motives, the sense of need, but also the sense of desire that impels people into those circumstances is actually pretty important. It's especially important, it's important for all of us, like who live in the gold world, but it's also important for the policymakers who think they can solve these problems with law, who want to criminalize it and say, the problem is just, remove those people.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's the impetus for the book, really, to understand what makes people do this.
I think what you just said was pretty indicative of a lot of different industries. You'll see that when things become larger scale, larger industries, like mining or even just the car industry, for example, people tend to be blamed in order to keep the profit flowing, is what I've noticed.
Mhm.
Yeah, we often, and then, the lowest people on the rung are held responsible for problems that they are inhabiting, and bad solutions to those problems are blamed instead of figuring out what is structurally wrong. Both of these things are true, and they're true here, and they're true everywhere. Um, and, I do hope that some of the lessons that the book offers, or I guess they're not lessons, they're my shared learning. I'm trying to share what I learned with others over this long period. I do hope that people can analogize that can generalize from that, can say, yes, what we see there at least generates questions that can be transferred elsewhere. Um, and one shouldn't take an argument and just plop it down any
Mhm.
place, but the questions can be asked elsewhere, and they might generate other answers. But my hope is that one can see that these things are translatable, and they're translatable because there are, large structures that ensure that those phenomena occur in different places in different forms.
So, what is next? What is your next research project, or what are you currently working on?
Well, I actually, I brought out three books this year. This one, a volume of poetry, and the edited memoir of Rafael Sanchez,
Hmm.
which is a thinking about what happened in Venezuela. Um, and of course, after this kind of everything coming together, it's a moment of transition for me. I'm finishing a little collection of essays for Fordham Press called In Theory Anthropology, which asks, what did other theoretical, what happened to anthropological concepts when they were taken up by in other disciplines and other
Hmm.
theoretical projects? So whether that's the idea of the gift or the idea of kinship, the idea of the ancestral. And I continue to write with, think with, go back to, communicate with all the people in South Africa. It's not so much a project as a kind of, I suppose now, life's relationship. And I have been moved to respond to and try and intervene in the current crisis around informal mining in South Africa and elsewhere. So some of that has been more journalistic, more policy oriented, and some of it has been more theoretical. So I won't abandon this world, but I'm not quite sure about the next big project. You can imagine that after all those years that I'm old. So, so I don't know how many big projects of this, not of this sort, but how many big projects await me. But I'll continue to try and learn from that world and from all those people.
So thank you again. To our listeners, we're talking with Dr. Rosalind Morris about her book, Unstable Ground, The Lives, Deaths, and Afterlives of Gold in South Africa. Could you tell our listeners where they can find your book?
Well, they should be able to find it at most big bookstores or those distributors, some of those online distributors that sell books. It's published by Columbia University Press, and it can also be purchased directly from the press. And if your readers want to be in touch with me at rcm24@columbia.edu, I can share with them a coupon for a discount.
Great. That's the first time we got a coupon. Hey. Well, thank you again for being on the show. And for our listeners, don't forget if you're watching us on YouTube to like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you like. You can find us on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, our website. And until next time, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. Distribution of Anthropotamus is in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. Please continue to follow us on Instagram and Twitter @Anthropotamus for our latest episodes, show notes, and book discussion schedule.